All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on when you're watching this. This will be another reading brief of what's called the analysis and assessment of the gateway process. And we're basically going to walk through initially a memorandum between two parties and then a fairly detailed explanation of what's known as the gateway experience, the brain hemisphere synchronization in perspective. And that's what I'll title these videos, and these will be titled reading briefs. There are no chapters, so I'm going to stop around the 45, 50, 60 minute mark, depending on how much sidebar discussion occurs with myself while you listen. And from here, just the gateway program or the gateway process is just another variation of the remote viewing, psychoenergetics, parapsychology, telepathy, ESP. And this one was, I don't think this was actually handed off to the Army. I think this was the Army being briefed on it and then going off and starting their own program in order to sort of validate things themselves, or possibly, of course, I think, as I mentioned, this type of research is ancient. It's established in a lot of sacred texts and sort of secret fraternities and things like that, variations of it. And it's, a lot of these people probably had understandings or belief systems predicated on some of this stuff. And, I think in some regards, when you read this stuff, it's written fairly intelligently and lucidly. Open-minded people were enthused, at least, to be working on this stuff. So let's get started here. This is Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. This is a letter to the commander of U.S. Army Operational Group at Fort Meade. 1. You tasked me to provide an assessment of the gateway experience in terms of its mechanics and ultimate practicality. As I set out to fulfill the tasking, it soon became clear that in order to assess the validity and practicality of the process, I needed to do enough supporting research and analysis to fully understand how and why the process works. Frankly, sir, that proved to be an extremely involved and difficult business. Initially, based on conversations with a physician who took the gateway training with me, I had recourse to the biomedical models developed by Isaac Bentoff to obtain information concerning the physical aspects of the process. Then I found it necessary to delve into various sources for information concerning quantum mechanics in order to be able to describe the nature and functioning of human consciousness. I had to be able to construct a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions under the influence of the brain hemisphere synchronization technique employed by Gateway. Once this was done, the next step involved recourse to theoretical physics in order to explain the character of the time-space dimension and the means by which expanded human consciousness transcends it in achieving Gateway's objectives. Finally, I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomena of out-of-body states into the language of physical science to remove the stigma of its occult connotations and put it in a frame of reference suited to objective assessment. I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors affecting such related techniques as hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation, so that their objectives and mode of functioning could be compared in the reader's mind with the gateway experience as the model of its underlying mechanics was developed. Additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusion of the paper. I indicate that at times these related techniques may provide useful entry points to accelerate movement into the gateway experience. Niels Bohr, the renowned physicist, once responded to his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics by saying, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical." The physics of altered human consciousness deal with some conceptualizations that are not easily grasped or visualized exclusively in the context of ordinary left brain linear thinking. So to borrow Dr. Bohr's mode of expression, parts of this paper will require not only logic, but a touch of right brain intuitive insight to achieve a complete, comfortable grasp of the concepts involved. Nevertheless, once that is done, I am confident that their construction and application will stand up to the test of rational critique. Paradoxically, having gone to such great lengths to avoid trying to render judgments based on an occult or dogmatic frame of reference, in the end I found it necessary to return, at least briefly, to the question of the impact of the gateway experience on common belief systems. I did so because although it was essential to avoid attempting to render an assessment in the context of such systems, I felt that it was necessary after having completed the analysis to point out that the resulting conclusions do not do any violence to the fundamental mainstream of either Eastern or Western belief systems. Unless that point is clearly established, the danger exists that some people will reject the whole concept of the gateway experience in the mistaken belief that it contradicts and is therefore alien to all that they hold to be right and true. This study is certainly not designed to be the last word on the subject, but I hope that the validity of its basic structure and of the fundamental concepts upon which it is based will make it a useful guide for the USA INSCOM personnel who are required to take the gateway training or work with gateway materials. Wayne M. McDonnell, Commander. So that's, I think that's a pretty good intro and a primer. As I mentioned in the reading brief 2 for Sunstreak annual report, the what I call the sacred arts, or what I should have said is even the quadrivium, is apparently they were priming everybody with that type of learning, physics, mechanics. They were taking people who are open-minded, and there's a lot of jokes about, especially in the movies, and I've even fallen victim to it, but just the way the people in the army are portrayed as sort of being unintelligent and bronze over brain type thing. And what we're finding when we look at this kind of stuff, I don't know what the physical or mental regiment really was, but the people who were authorizing these things were clearly of a higher state of consciousness, right? And that higher state of consciousness, whether you call it ascension, enlightenment, autodidactism, whatever you want to reference this transformation of someone from an I guess not from a closed mind, but from a learned mind to an open mind, that's also actually a ritualistic process within a lot of sacred arts and texts, where you have to learn and then unlearn again to see the whole, the part. It's like broken to be whole again. And in some cases, actually, there's a direct correlation with many religious texts, in that the only way to know the Father is to suffer as the Father. And I don't necessarily mean physical violence or mental trauma or anything like that. However, in today's age, November 2019, a lot of people live in safety and security, so there's not a lot of there's just not a lot of motivation or any catalysts for many people to move forward out of that safety and security. Again, not being compromised or becoming unsafe, but the entire notion of someone being faced with having to move out of their religious beliefs a little bit, or at least just step out of them long enough to accept someone else's position in life or their belief systems, that itself often is the trauma for most people. Doing 100 push-ups or 100 jumping jacks isn't that hard. In 2 or 3 weeks, most people can learn how to do it if they just bust, maybe a month on average, but most people can can do that. I mean, it's not as difficult as people make it out to be on television. But doing that, as well as learning physics, and consider the type of colleges that a lot of these guys are going into when they go into military school or air war college and things like that. They're taking the same academic classes as a university might, but they're not necessarily engaging in the party aspects of it all the time. I don't think, there's not the whole notion of leisure is both incorporated and exhausted in the physical components of the colleges, right? The 100 push-ups, the 100 sit-ups, the whatever they're doing, running for 4 miles, jumping barriers, swimming long distances, climbing stuff. And honestly, that's it. I don't know why it's not mentioned in the sacred texts. It's one of the few, the physical components of your body and how that affects your mind and what that does to your confidence and actually what running itself, jogging and running, the effects it has on your brain and how it makes it easier for you to adapt to new ideas and thoughts is not really mentioned really in a lot of the sacred texts that I've read or religious texts or anything like that. A lot of it is just, not to insult it, but just to use the term, casually, it's mental masturbation. It's just like, keep thinking, keep believing, keep thinking, keep believing. Not doing. You have to do to learn. You have to exercise your body as well as exercise your mind. And if you're somebody who's gone through or put yourself through, a heavy physical regiment as well as a mental one, there is a synchronization that occurs. And I think often when people, like the title of this document here, The Gateway Experience, Brain Hemisphere Synchronization in Perspective, when they go through this, and even in the first paragraph there, you see the word in quotations, Gateway Experience and Hemi-Sync. Hemi-Sync is related to music and tones and vibrations, helping people connect their brain, their left and right side. But physical activity does that as well. It really does. And it does change your chemical makeup. It changes your body. It changes what your body can do. And once you see yourself climb to the top of that hill or make it up to the top of the hill after 4 or 5 miles carrying 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, whatever it is, whatever obstacle is before you, once you achieve that, things don't seem endless anymore. They don't seem as daunting because you recognize that achievement, the principles that led you, or the motivation that led you, or the learning that led you to that achievement can be reapplied to something else now. So it's really just about defining how you get to your path. Even if you don't make it to the finish line at the exact same time as everyone else, it is about defining your own path so that you can use that sort of almost as a mental, like a memory arts, like I mentioned in the Sunstreak stuff. It's a form of physical mnemonics where you have these paths that you set forth for yourself that you can use to try to overcome the next obstacle. Not saying everything becomes easy, but the resistance to doing something new becomes less obstructing. It kind of breaks down your own walls, and it doesn't matter male or female, any of that stuff. If you're already noticing how often some of the rhetoric in here says he or she, not she, that's just the way people used to write sometimes. It wasn't denoted. I mean, I once made I think it was in the first reading of Cryptological Aspects of ESP, and I remember her name now, but I think it's Barbara Dunn or Deborah Dunn, who I've watched many videos on a YouTube channel called New Thinking Aloud, hosted by Jeffrey Mishlove. And the insights that she provides and the learning and just the perspective she brought, and there's a lot of other women involved in it too. There's a Jessica Utz, I think, who came around at the tail end of it from her own avenue of interest and tried to, sort out what was actually going on. But there's no male or female in that. There may be specific qualities that favor each sex, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's trying. Everyone has the opportunity to try. So with that little bit of intro from the commander there and myself expounding on just a little bit of motivational discussion, let's get started with the gateway experience, brain hemisphere synchronization in perspective. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness involving brain hemispheric synchronization, or Hemi-Sync, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay operation of related methods such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share some common aspects with the gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand gateway by comparison as we proceed. So they're using those known terms as a way to build a path for any onlooker, or in this case the people reading this document, to begin to formulate their own understandings using their abilities themselves. It's excuse me, that's all that really means. So hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone in the biomedical engineering models of Itzhak Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of direct access to the sensory motor cortex and pleasure centers, and lower cerebral portions of the right side of the human brain following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear reasoning component of the mind. It fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage to the right hemisphere of the mind. To the right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, nonverbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes to it without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction to a soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli, to include hypnotic suggestion, are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere, where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. See Exhibit A or Exhibit 1, next page. Stimulation of the corresponding area of the cortex causes intermediate response in the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged and is referred to the appropriate area of sensory cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion or in the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as the one that informs the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to in the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity normally held in reserve as a result of left hemisphere selection and control responses. This aspect will become significant in the context of the gateway process when attention is given to examining the way the hypnosis may be used to accelerate progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. Let me just jump and see where we're going with this last paragraph. All right, so let me stop and pause. So in a way, what he's sort of referencing is, how do we make an accelerated learning program here, and can sleep and music help us do that through the power of suggestion and hypnosis? That's it's a functional description of the brain and how they think it's reacting, but the overall, I think, synopsis or summarization of it is an accelerated learning aspect. And anybody who's listened to music to fall asleep, or potentially watched a movie and fallen asleep watching that, and had that the feeling that you were entering the movie, or you woke up and the movie was still on, or you thought it was over, or perhaps even thought you were part of the movie. That's all subliminal suggestion by way of external stimuli. I'm not completely sure on what he means by unused potential in the right hemisphere via the left. I do understand what's being said in terms of passing information. I don't understand how the left hemisphere may filter stuff. That doesn't quite make sense. And I think just from a layman's perspective, I'm assuming that the eyes have something to do with it, as well as the ears, since abstractly referencing all of this that's already been read by myself and what you may be reading on your own, technically you could say that there's an ear and eye for each side of the brain. And we know that in some way, some people have heard that the notion that each leg is a little bit longer, one leg is a little bit longer than the other, one arm is a little bit longer than the other. There's just always a slight difference on each appendage on the physical aspect. So it's possible that some of us have more defined separations, and other people have more or less defined separations, and that thereby gives everybody their unique personality, their talents, and their traits, and things like that too. And just before we get into transcendental meditation, obviously I mentioned music being Hemi-Sync, and Hemi-Sync being the process which was actually patented by the Monroe Institute. I think everyone has at one time or another listened to so-called transcendental music. Or I remember in the late 90s and early 2000s when there was just a wave of music on CDs where it was just called New World and New Wave and New Age and all this new. And they were all basically specifically designed to, I think, utilize the Hemi-Sync process. And then on the opposite end of that too, you have a lot of music that completely was the antithesis of that, and just went against all known conventions of what we might consider pleasant music. I mean, I don't know how well classical music works, but I'm sure that there are correlations with that kind of thing as well. So, transcendental meditation. On the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted to the gray matter in the cerebral cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves will stimulate and eventually polarize the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus, starting from the toes and up. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in a book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence, states that the standing acoustical waves are the result of the altered rhythm of heart sounds which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation, and which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentoff, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemisphere may be explained as a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a current along the sensory cortex. Bentoff also notes that most of the described symptoms start on the left side of the body, means that it is mostly a development occurring in the right hemisphere. That's interesting. I've heard doctors say that if you experience a trauma on your body physically on one end of your right shoulder gets hurt, later in life you start to feel pain on the left side. Although normally a period of meditation involving intense concentration and practice for 5 years or some is required to bring up the Kundalini, Bentoff states that exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 through 7 hertz cycles per second for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentoff cites an example. Repeated riding in a car whose suspension and seat combination produce the right range of vibrations, or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies caused, for instance, by an air conditioning duct. He also notes that the cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have particularly sensitive nervous systems. So let's pause on let's pause. Let's look at the chart. So number 3 is Transcendental Meditation. We're looking at figure A, which is a drawing of the brain. And that's interesting. Okay, so there's a hand and an arm over one part of it, and we're looking at a profile, a hand drawing a profile facing right with a hand drawing of a face, and polarization of gray matter. Nothing to, if anybody's taken a look at this symbol here in the middle, what's this look like to you? You think the religious people, you think Druids and the medieval ages hadn't already dissected people? Of course. We're pretty sure that symbol comes from something. We've probably seen that symbol somewhere, haven't we? So then the motor and sensory cortex and the third lateral ventricles. Now we have a more official drawing of the brain, and we're not looking at the individual processes, but we're looking at the organic components as they're named. So at the end of number 3, Bentoff states that the exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 through 7 hertz for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. He cites an example of repeatedly riding in a car, or for instance the air conditioner duct. And what he means by that is just a small tangential story as it relates to MK Ultra and torture procedures. They had learned that the water torture actually wasn't as effective if it was consistent. And the reason why is because people that were receptive had, as the last sentence here, the sequence in susceptible people may have particularly sensitive nervous systems. What happened is the continuous drop by drop at a defined moment of intervals actually allowed those people to exit, to go into a transcendental state and shut off their pain centers. And so once they figured that out, the torture became randomized and chaotic, and the war theater and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And it's interesting. And what they mean by the air duct is that when it has a predefined sound to it, or there's something that you're able to click into or to sort of listen to, that is at a constant and succinct pattern, wave, or tone of sound or vibration, that's going to allow you to enter your transcendental state more easily. And just to reference again, I think I mentioned in the Sunstreak reading briefs where, you run, or I would run and play some music and then disappear for a couple hours as I jogged, or driving my car where you're just really listening to traffic or the hum of your vehicle. I wouldn't doubt that a lot of crashes have occurred because of that. It's also probably the reason why you have what I endearingly call idiot functions in your vehicle. And those idiot functions are the don't forget your key bong, your headlights are on blinker, your seatbelt's still locked because your foot is on the brake. All of these idiot functions for us because we do get into the entire experience is meditative, and probably just like race car drivers do, they get into their own zone. And if you've ever driven a sports car, maybe driven, let's say, a Cutlass, a 1969 Cutlass versus a 2019 Corvette, the driving experience is significantly different in that the Cutlass is like floating on air, and the Corvette, even though it has really great suspension, you can tell when you drive over a dime. You can literally feel it. You can feel that you're riding over the smallest item, and that's how sensitive the suspension is. Whereby the Cutlass, because of the tires and the size of the steering wheel and the way the energy was dispersed and differentiated and leveraged against the mechanics of the Cutlass, it was meant to be smoother, so you felt like you were hovering. And I'm sure that those experiences have induced all kinds of transcendental states in all of us, as noted in all the research that I've read already and what we haven't read yet. It's just, this happens to everybody. Everybody goes through this in one way or another. It doesn't mean you're telepathic or anything like that, but you have at one point or another achieved these states on your own, whether it be waking or dreaming. So that's just a little sidebar of information there. So biofeedback. The third consciousness-altering methodology, which will be briefly described, is biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor and sensory cortices, and asserted pain or pleasure centers. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere to visualize the desired result and then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex, pain or pleasure, or other areas in the manner needed to produce the desired result. Special self-monitoring devices such as the digital thermometer are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into assessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left brain can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external, objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that the left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation in the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in the temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally, left brain, associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved and can begin to emphasize, by memory recall, the same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this process, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed, the body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners who have no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave pattern on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory-validated means by which subjects may quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by the sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation. So that's a lot to absorb. Let's look at number 4 again. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed. The body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. That's a pretty profound statement there, coming from a military document, right? And I think I don't want to elaborate too much on that, but I want to actually go. I think that says what it needs to say. But let's look at this other paragraph, the last one. Excuse me. Display of the subject's brainwave pattern on a cathode ray tube has been proven to be a laboratory validated means. So I don't know about you, but I remember in the 80s, depending on how old you are, the you don't watch the TV is watching you. So that quote used to pass around from a lot of people, at least the ones that I hung out with. And interestingly enough, there is a patent in the CIA library, in the Crest library, where they were able to pull soft images from tube TVs, meaning your TV was in fact watching you, and at the very least they were able to make out that someone or many people were sitting in front of the TV at a specific moment if they wanted. And the reception, this is the trick on that. You'd be like, well, how did they receive the message? Well, it's because your TV was also a transmitter. It wasn't just a receiver. And we basically put all these things in our homes. So I think things with like the Nielsen's rating system, or the Nielsen's, what they call Nielsen's boxes. These were special boxes that were put on people's TVs, and because people had agreed to allow this group, Nielsen group, to collect statistical data on what the people were watching and whether or not they watched it fully and what commercials they watched and things like that. But what we're really most likely looking at is a few parallel constructed covert means of also tracking alpha and theta waves in people, as well as, to some degree, I guess you could call it an invasion of privacy. And I don't want to make anybody paranoid, and I'm not going to make an exacerbated comment about it, but I mean, how do we think X-ray or a TSA scanner or the monitor I'm using to record myself right now, I mean, how far do we think that technology has come? How far do we think that they've come? We have video game consoles like the Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo, these various gaming platforms that create virtual reality based on movements and sound collection, and using light to saturate using an infrared light, which you may not pick up with your own eyes, but you're still being hit with those things. It's still there. Doesn't mean it's not there because you can't see it. It's just that our eyes don't see the full spectrum as clearly as we wish it does. So, as I mentioned in the Sunstreak debriefing, there were groups tasked with countermeasures, and there were even before that, in the 60s, we had the NSA already coming up with pretty, convincingly too coincidental ideas about how to block things. And one of theirs statements were the ionization of the atmosphere around you. Now, I don't know how many of you had those big tube TVs, but I personally, every time I could be outside of my house, and the minute my parents turned on the TV, I would feel it. I would hear it, I would feel it. I would feel a twinge or a ting, or like I feel it even now because of all of the currents around me. But having lived in an area that wasn't completely saturated by power lines and smart meters and everything being, I'm literally right now, I'm basically in a geofence of 100 feet of 3 different routers and Wi-Fi transmitters. There's mine in my home, there's one in the people above us, there's one on the left and one on the right. And because of the city that I live in, I'm literally in I'm basically being bombarded nonstop, and I feel and hear and feel that same sound that I would hear when the TV would go on then. And on top of just the static electricity, right? Everybody remembers you used to be able to put your hand on the TV or take a piece of paper and put it on the tube of the TV on the screen, and the paper would stick to the TV screen because of how much static electricity was there. So where us as consumers and sort of being, let's just say, late bloomers, we've been exposed to a lot of various technologies that I think in some cases have been for the benefit of us. I mean, the Apple Watch could certainly be one of these tracking mechanisms that teach us the special self-monitoring devices. And that's great and all, but I mean, what it also does, and I've said this before, because of the animosity, the enmity, as even introduced in the beginning of this specific document, the people who are going to react poorly to this information because of religious or philosophical beliefs. What do you think they're going to do when they find out there's countermeasures? What would you do? And then, as I mentioned, I think in the very first, second or third video of cryptological aspects of ESP, or maybe I didn't, I think I had typed this out on a forum, but can you imagine in the 20s or 30s or maybe the early 1800s, if your children started to exhibit traits and qualities that you were taught and brought up with the understanding that they were demonic? You would take your kid to you would do 2 things. You would do everything you can to protect them because you don't care, they're your child, or you would bring them to the church, and the church would do all kinds of stuff to them. And we know that how that really went in those times, and still most likely happening now, just more covertly. And then, with that said, if you wanted to protect your child, you kind of had no other way other than being fortunate in that you were surrounded around other families who recognized the same learnings and teachings and the same potential and talents in your children, or you might have to go to a secret fraternity and say, well, we have a gifted one here. What do we do? What do we do? So it's like you either got it beat and tortured out of you, or you were nurtured and still kind of controlled by the ones who brought you up. So it's important to really just, I think, even go back at the beginning of this document, scrub this video, put it on pause, and go back to the beginning and listen to what the commander wrote out. Just don't bring your stigmas, and the stigmas won't scare you, because it's not the writing or this commander or the scientists who are doing it. It's your own personal or their own personal fears and biases that are creating these fears and this stress about this kind of research. And with that comes people who are going to create countermeasures or take countermeasures and effectively weaponize them. And weaponize them as suppressing, or as tracking, as torture, as whatever. I mean, there's no right or moral obligation or ethical foundation or law of the land or law of the sea that would give anybody permission to do such a thing. Yet, I personally believe it goes on. You don't have to believe that. I think there's enough law through Congress and legislation that's been passed. I think there's enough patents that the government themselves own, as well as private corporations, that clearly show people have created weapons out of this research. And in most cases, it's to suppress it and or track the ones who are capable, and or a covert recruiting method. And for me, I'd prefer to be on the learning side of this, especially with children. And I mean, anybody who would turn their child over to the church, I guess in those times, obviously poverty and working hard, it's a different mindset, and I get that, a different emotional mindset and all kinds of other extraneous types of concerns. But to give your child up to somebody else is if your fear is greater than your love, if your fear of what your child can do is greater than your love for your child, I guess you have to give your kid up. I guess that's what you would do. Not seek out more knowledge, not you yourself learn to cope and deal, and you yourself have to grow up into a different mindset. But all right, I'm going to end this here on number 4 with biofeedback. Feel free to find this declassified document yourself right there and just go through it on your own. We'll be back, and the second reading of this will start out with Gateway and Hemi-Sync. All right, have a good day.